Imagine trying to trace a letter sent in 1850. Not a famous letter, not a historically significant document, just an ordinary piece of mail, the kind that millions of people sent every year during that period. You want to know when it was sent, which route it traveled, and where it ended up. So you go to the archive. You sit down. You begin looking through the records. And then you find nothing. Not a damaged file. Not a water-stained page that is difficult to read. Just an empty space where the record should be. This kind of experience is more common than most people realize, and it happens with a striking level of consistency when the subject is postal records from before 1870. That year, 1870, keeps appearing. Researchers working in different archives, in different countries, across different areas of historical inquiry, keep running into the same boundary. On one side of it, records exist. They may be incomplete. They may be difficult to access, but they are there. On the other side, the earlier side, the side that covers the 1840s, the 1850s, and the 1860s, the material is often simply absent, not reduced, not sparse, in many cases entirely gone. And what makes this particularly interesting is that 1870 is not a year associated with any single catastrophic event that would explain such a widespread pattern of loss. Historians have noted this. Archivists have flagged it in their own internal documentation. Researchers who work with 19th century primary sources encounter it regularly enough that it has become a recognized problem in the field. Not a fringe observation, but a documented gap that specialists are aware of and have attempted to explain. And yet, despite that awareness, there is still no single clean explanation that fully satisfies the question. The answers that exist are partial. They cover some of the evidence. They don't cover all of it. Some point to fires. This is perhaps the most commonly cited explanation, and it has some basis in historical fact. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed enormous quantities of documents. Other fires in other cities, during the same general period, caused similar losses. Fire was a genuine and serious threat to paper records throughout the 19th century, and archivists of that era had limited tools for preventing or responding to it. So when records are missing from this period, fire is often the first explanation offered. It sounds reasonable. It is sometimes accurate, but it doesn't explain the pattern on its own. Others mention administrative changes. The argument here is that postal systems underwent significant reorganization during the late 1860s and early 1870s, and that during those transitions, older records were considered obsolete and discarded. New classification systems replaced old ones. New formats were introduced. Materials that didn't fit the new structure were simply set aside and eventually lost. Again, this has some historical support. Postal reform was genuinely happening during this period in multiple countries. But the question is whether administrative transition alone accounts for the scale and consistency of what is missing. A few researchers suggest that record-keeping simply wasn't a priority before this period, that the early postal systems were too informal, too decentralized, and too poorly resourced to generate and maintain the kind of documentation that later systems produced. Under this view, the records don't exist because they were never created in the first place. That is a different kind of explanation, and it carries its own implications. If records were never created, the gap reflects the limits of early bureaucratic practice. If records were created but later lost or removed, the gap reflects something that happened after the fact. These are very different situations, and distinguishing between them turns out to be harder than it might seem. But here is where the explanation begins to weaken, because when researchers look at what the postal system actually was during the pre-1870 period, the idea that it was too informal or too small to generate records doesn't quite hold up. In the United States alone, the Post Office Department by the 1850s was one of the largest government operations in the country. It employed thousands of workers. It managed an extensive and growing network of routes. It handled millions of pieces of mail every year. Operations of that scale generate paperwork, contracts, route reports, postmaster appointments, delivery registers, complaint logs, inspection records. All of these should exist in significant quantity. And yet, for this specific period, they are often absent. That absence becomes more difficult to explain when you look at what to survive. because it is not the case that nothing from this period remains. Some records do exist, and when you examine them, a pattern begins to emerge. The material that tends to survive is often financial in nature: ledgers, revenue summaries, accounts of funds received and disbursed. The material that tends to be missing is more operational: delivery records, route logs, internal correspondence, inspection reports. That imbalance raises a question that the standard explanations don't fully address. If the conditions were bad enough to destroy operational records, why did financial records so often make it through the same conditions? This raises questions about the nature of the loss itself. Random destruction through fire, flood, or neglect does not typically produce selective results. When a building burns, it burns. When storage degrades, it degrades across the materials present. But what the evidence suggests, in at least some cases, is not random loss. It is patterned loss. Certain types of records are consistently absent. Others are consistently present. That kind of pattern is difficult to produce by accident. And once you notice it, the simpler explanations become harder to accept without reservation. At first, it seems like a small detail. A few missing files here, a few absent registers there. The kind of thing that happens with old documents and should not be surprising. But as the picture becomes clearer, the detail grows larger. Researchers working in one archive find the same gap that researchers working in a different archive, in a different country, have already noted. The pre-1870 postal record problem is not confined to one institution, one nation, or one administrative system. Similar gaps appear in British postal archives from the same era. French records from the Second Empire period show comparable inconsistencies. Colonial postal systems in Canada and Australia from the 1850s and 1860s carry similar holes. That cross-national consistency is one of the most difficult aspects of this pattern to explain. If the problem were caused by a localized disaster, a specific fire in a specific building, you would expect it to be localized. A fire in Washington does not affect archives in London. An administrative transition in France does not automatically produce matching gaps in Canadian records. And yet the pattern repeats. Across different governments, different administrative cultures, different languages, and different record-keeping traditions, the same general period is marked by the same general absence. That repetition demands an explanation that goes beyond any single cause. It doesn't fully make sense, and that is precisely what makes it worth examining. The explanations that exist are not wrong, exactly. Fire did destroy records. Administrative transitions did result in the disposal of older materials. Early systems were sometimes poorly organized. All of these things are true, but they are also true of other periods where the record is far more complete. So the question is not just what happened to these records, but why this particular window of time, this particular set of document types, and this particular pattern of loss appears with such consistency across so many different places. Some researchers have begun looking at the timing more carefully, and this is where another detail becomes interesting. If the records were lost during the reforms of the early 1870s, discarded as part of the modernization process, you would expect the losses to follow the reforms. The reforms happen, then the records disappear. But in several cases, the pattern seems to run in the other direction. The gaps in the record appear to predate the major administrative transitions, not follow them. Material from the mid-1860s is sometimes missing even when the reforms that would supposedly have caused its disposal didn't take effect until years later. That timing discrepancy is subtle, but it means the standard explanation doesn't fully align with the actual evidence. There's also the question of awareness. The people who managed these archives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were not unaware of what they held. Archivists cataloged materials. Administrators reviewed holdings. Scholars requested access. If enormous quantities of records had simply degraded or burned, there would typically be some documentation of that loss. Inventory records noting what was there before it was gone, reports of damage, requests for reconstruction. Some of that documentation exists, but in a number of cases, the gap in the records is matched by a gap in the documentation of the loss itself. The records are missing, and so is any clear account of what happened to them. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because it means that in at least some cases, The absence of pre-1870 postal records is not accompanied by a clear historical trail explaining how or why they became absent. They are simply not there, and the silence around their absence is, in its own way, as interesting as the absence itself. It doesn't confirm any specific explanation, but it does make the straightforward accounts feel slightly less complete. Researchers who work carefully in this area tend to hold their conclusions loosely. Most are not arguing that something deliberately hidden caused these gaps. The evidence doesn't clearly support that, but most are also not fully satisfied with existing explanations. The gaps are real. The pattern is real. The cross-national consistency is real. And the selective nature of what is missing, certain document types, certain time windows, certain operational categories, continues to stand out as something that the standard narrative of loss through disaster and neglect doesn't entirely account for. So the question remains open. Why does 1870 keep appearing as a turning point in the archival record? Why are the records from before it so consistently difficult to find? Not in one country, not in one archive, but across multiple systems and multiple continents. Why does financial material survive while operational material disappears? Why do the gaps sometimes predate the reforms that are supposed to explain them? And why, in some cases, is there no clear documentation of how or when the loss occurred? These are not questions with easy answers. They are questions that careful researchers have been asking for some time, and to which the historical record has not yet offered a complete response. The boundary of 1870 remains, and what lies on the other side of it remains genuinely unclear. The official explanation for the missing pre-1870 postal records is, on the surface, a reasonable one. It is not a single cause, but a combination of several factors that historians have identified over the years. Taken together, these factors are presented as sufficient to explain why the archival record from this period is so incomplete. The explanation is taught, repeated, and generally accepted in most academic and archival contexts. And for many people who encounter it for the first time, it sounds entirely plausible. But plausibility is not the same as completeness. And when the explanation is examined more carefully, certain parts of it begin to raise questions that it doesn't fully answer. The starting point of the official account is the state of postal systems themselves before 1870. The argument is simple. These were young, expanding institutions. They were not yet mature enough, organized enough, or well-funded enough to maintain the kind of systematic record-keeping that later generations of archivists would expect. In the United States, the Post Office Department was growing rapidly during the mid-1800s. New routes were being added constantly. Newly acquired territories were being brought into the system. The organization was absorbing enormous logistical challenges. At the same time, it was trying to manage day-to-day operations across a vast and geographically diverse country. Under those conditions, the argument goes, careful and consistent documentation was simply not always possible. This part of the explanation has a certain logic to it. Rapid expansion does create administrative strain. An organization focused on growth and operational management may not have had the resources or the institutional culture to prioritize long-term record preservation. The people running post offices in small frontier towns during the 1850s were not archivists. They were administrators dealing with immediate practical demands. So the idea that record-keeping was inconsistent during this period is not unreasonable. It reflects something real about how these institutions functioned. But it also raises a question. If inconsistency explains the gaps, why are the gaps so consistent in what they target? Another piece of the official explanation concerns where records were kept. Before the postal system became more centralized, local postmasters maintained their own logs and registers. They recorded deliveries, tracked payments, and managed their own paperwork at the local level. Central authorities in Washington, or in London, or Paris, did not always collect these. Local records. They did not always require local offices to submit copies of their documentation. This meant that a significant portion of the total record existed only at the local level, in individual post offices scattered across the country, rather than in any central repository. When those local offices closed, relocated, or were restructured, the records they held were often simply lost. That is a meaningful observation. It explains something real about why central archives, might be incomplete even when local records once existed, but it also creates a question of its own. If local postmasters were keeping records, if documentation was being generated at the local level, then those records existed at some point. The question is not whether they were ever created. The question is what happened to them. Saying they were lost at the local level is not the same as explaining how they were lost, when they were lost, or whether the loss was uniform across all types of records or selective in some way. Paper cost and storage limitations are also part of the official account. Before the latter half of the 19th century, paper was a more expensive and less abundant material than it would later become. Archival storage, purpose-built, climate-controlled, organized, was not widely available. Records were stored in whatever space happened to be available. Attics, basements, spare rooms, and repurposed storage areas were common. These were not ideal conditions for long-term preservation. Heat, humidity, pests, and simple physical deterioration could damage or destroy paper records over time without any dramatic event taking place. The gradual degradation of improperly stored documents accounts for some portion of what is missing. This is also a reasonable point. Environmental damage to old paper records is a well-documented phenomenon. Archivists today deal regularly with materials that have been degraded by exactly the conditions described. So this part of the explanation is not invented. It reflects real and documented processes, but it does not explain selectivity. Environmental degradation tends to be indiscriminate. It affects whatever is stored in a given space, regardless of the content or category of the document. Yet what researchers observe in archival gaps is not indiscriminate loss. It follows patterns, and that pattern is harder to account for through gradual physical deterioration alone. Then there is the fire argument. This is perhaps the most dramatic element of the official explanation, and the one most people find easiest to accept. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is the example most frequently cited. It was one of the most destructive urban fires in American history, and it genuinely did destroy large quantities of documents, records, and institutional memory held in the city at the time. Other fires during the same general era caused similar losses in other locations. Fire was a constant and serious threat throughout the 19th century, and its role in the destruction of historical documents cannot be dismissed. It was real and it matters, but this is where it becomes unclear. The Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed records that were physically located in Chicago. It did not reach Washington. It did not affect London or Paris or the colonial postal archives in Canada or Australia. If fire is the primary explanation for the missing pre-1870 records, it only works as an explanation for materials that were in the specific locations affected by specific fires. For the cross-national pattern of missing records, the same gaps appearing in multiple countries and multiple archive systems, fire in any single location cannot be the answer. Something broader would need to account for a pattern that appears consistently across different continents. The 1870s also brought significant administrative reforms to postal systems in many countries, and these reforms form another part of the official explanation. In the United States, the post-Civil War period brought reorganization and standardization efforts. In Britain, major structural changes were underway. In other countries, the integration of telegraph services with postal infrastructure was reshaping how communication systems were organized and managed. As new systems replaced old ones, new classification formats were introduced. Old records that didn't fit the new formats were sometimes considered outdated and no longer worth preserving. They were set aside. In some cases, they were deliberately discarded. This explanation has genuine historical support. Administrative transitions do produce the disposal of older materials. It happens in modern organizations as well. When a new system replaces an old one, the documentation generated under the old system often doesn't survive the transition intact. So the argument that postal reforms in the 1870s led to the disposal of pre-1870 records is not without basis. Some of what is missing was probably lost this way. The question is whether this accounts for the full scale and the full pattern of what researchers find absent. At first, it seems like the official account covers the necessary ground. Take poor early record keeping, add fire and physical disasters, include deliberate disposal during administrative reform, and the gaps become explainable. Each cause addresses a portion of the problem. Together, they appear to form a complete picture. And for researchers who accept this framework, the missing records are simply an expected consequence of historical conditions, unfortunate, but not surprising. The explanation has been repeated often enough that it functions almost as a settled answer in many academic discussions. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept, because when researchers begin looking not just at the explanation, but at the actual evidence, the surviving inventories, the archival finding aids, the internal records of the archives themselves, certain details don't align cleanly with the official account. The most immediate issue is the consistency of the pattern. If the losses were caused by a combination of random factors, varying local conditions, different disasters in different places, inconsistent administrative decisions, you would expect the gaps to be irregular. Some archives should be more complete than others. Some time periods should be more affected than others. Some document types should survive in some places even when they are absent in others. But that is not consistently what researchers find. The gaps are unusually uniform in certain respects. Specific categories of documents, operational records, delivery registers, internal correspondence, tend to be absent across multiple archives and multiple countries. Financial records from the same periods and the same offices tend to survive more often. That selectivity is difficult to produce through a combination of random, uncoordinated causes. Random loss does not sort documents by category with any reliability, and yet the pattern of what is missing and what survives has a shape to it, a shape that the official combination of causes doesn't straightforwardly produce. The timing also raises questions that are worth examining. If records were discarded as part of the administrative reforms of the early 1870s, the losses should follow those reforms. The reform happens, the disposal happens, and then the material is gone. But in several documented cases, the gaps in the record appear to predate the reforms themselves. Material from the early and mid-1860s is sometimes absent in circumstances where the reforms that supposedly caused its disposal hadn't yet taken effect. That is a small but significant detail. It means that at least part of what is missing cannot be explained by the reform-era disposal argument, because it was gone before the relevant reforms occurred. There's also the question of documentation around the losses. When records are destroyed by fire, there are usually traces, reports of the fire, insurance claims, inventories taken before and after the event, correspondence noting what was lost. When records are deliberately discarded during administrative transitions, there are sometimes internal memos, disposal orders, or at least catalog entries, noting that materials, once held, are no longer present. In some cases involving pre-1870 postal records, those secondary traces exist. But in other cases, they don't. The records are absent, and so is any clear account of their absence. They simply are not there, with no explanation trail accompanying the gap. None of this means the official explanation is wrong in what it does cover. Fires happened. Records were improperly stored. Administrative transitions did lead to the disposal of older materials. These things are all true, and they account for some portion of the missing record. But the question that researchers keep returning to is whether they account for all of it, and especially whether they account for the selectivity, the cross-national consistency, and the timing irregularities that make the pattern more difficult to explain than the standard account suggests. The official explanation covers the broad outline. It is the specific details that continue to raise questions it doesn't yet fully answer. The first real doubt about the standard explanation doesn't come from a dramatic discovery. It doesn't arrive through a single document or a specific revelation. It comes from something quieter and more methodical, from the simple act of looking at the pattern of what is missing and asking whether that pattern makes sense under the explanation being offered. And when that question is asked carefully, the answer becomes uncomfortable, because the pattern doesn't quite fit what the standard explanation would predict. And that gap between what is expected and what is actually found is where the first serious doubt takes shape. To understand why the pattern matters, it helps to think about what random loss actually looks like. When records disappear through genuinely random causes, fire in one location, flooding in another, neglect in a third, the resulting gaps are irregular. Some offices lose everything. Others lose almost nothing. Some years are well represented in the archive. Others have only scattered fragments. The losses are distributed unevenly because the causes are uncoordinated. No single force is acting on all of the material at the same time in the same way. Random loss produces a jagged, unpredictable picture. It does not produce clean, consistent patterns across different institutions and different regions. But this is where it becomes unclear, because what researchers actually find in the pre-1870 postal record is not a jagged, unpredictable picture. The gaps tend to cluster. They appear in specific categories of documents more than others. They concentrate in specific time windows, particularly the period running from the 1840s through the late 1860s, more than in adjacent periods. And they appear across different archives in different countries, with a degree of similarity that is difficult to explain if the causes were truly random and uncoordinated. The pattern has a shape, and shape patterns don't typically emerge from random processes. This observation alone does not explain what caused the losses. It only suggests that whatever caused them may not have been as random as the standard account implies. That is a narrow but significant point. The standard explanation relies heavily on the idea that the losses were the product of varying, inconsistent, and largely uncoordinated factors. If the losses are actually consistent in certain important respects, then the explanation needs to account for that consistency. And at present, it does not do so fully. The clustering of gaps in specific document categories is one of the clearest aspects of the pattern. When archivists and researchers catalog what is missing from pre-1870 postal collections, certain types of records appear far more frequently on the absent list than others. Delivery registers, the logs that tracked what mail moved through which office on which day, are often missing. Route inspection reports, which documented the physical state and operational performance of mail routes, are frequently absent. Internal correspondence between postal officials, complaint logs, and records of staffing and postmaster appointments also tend to be underrepresented or entirely absent in many collections. These are operational records. They describe what the postal system was actually doing on a day-to-day basis. They capture the movement of mail, the performance of routes, and the internal communications of an organization managing a large and complex operation. Their absence leaves a specific kind of hole in the historical record, one that makes it difficult to reconstruct how the postal system actually functioned during this period, as opposed to how it was officially organized or financially managed. At first, it seems like this might simply reflect the priorities of those who preserved records. Perhaps the people responsible for maintaining archives in the late 19th century judged financial records to be more important than operational ones and preserved accordingly. That is a possible explanation, but it raises its own questions. Why would operational records, the records that document the actual work of the institution, be considered less worth preserving than financial summaries? And if this was a deliberate archival choice, where is the documentation of that choice? Archival decisions of that significance tend to leave traces. Selection policies, disposal orders, internal correspondence about what to keep. In many cases, those traces are difficult to find. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because sitting alongside the absent operational records in the same archives from the same periods are the financial records, ledgers, revenue summaries, payment accounts, records of funds received by local postmasters, and funds remitted to central authorities. These documents survive with significantly greater regularity than the operational materials from the same offices and the same years. That imbalance is one of the most consistently observed features of the pre-1870 postal record problem, and it is one that the standard explanation struggles to account for. Think about what that imbalance actually means in practical terms. A local post office in 1855 generates both operational records and financial records. The operational records document deliveries, routes, and internal communications. The financial records document money. Both sets of documents sit in the same building, under the same conditions, managed by the same postmaster. If a fire burns that building, both sets of records burn. If the building floods, both sets are damaged. If neglect allows the documents to deteriorate, the deterioration affects whatever is stored together. The physical conditions that destroy one type of record should, in most cases, also destroy the other. And yet what researchers find repeatedly, is that the financial records survived while the operational records did not. Some researchers have offered explanations for this imbalance that stay within the standard framework. One argument is that financial records were considered legally significant in ways that operational records were not. Money creates obligations. Accounts had to balance. Audits required documentation. So financial records may have been treated with greater care, stored more securely, copied more frequently, or transferred to more stable repositories. Under this view, the survival of financial records reflects the legal and institutional weight attached to monetary documentation, not anything unusual about how the losses occurred. That is a reasonable argument, and it probably explains part of the imbalance. Financial records in many institutional contexts do receive more careful treatment than other types of documentation, but it does not fully resolve the question, because the imbalance is not minor. In many collections, operational records from the pre-1870 period are almost entirely absent, while financial records from the same period are relatively intact. The degree of difference is large enough that differential care in storage doesn't obviously account for all of it. Something more than careful filing would be needed to produce such consistent and widespread selectivity across so many different institutions. There is also the question of what the specific time window of missing records tells us. The gaps cluster most heavily in the period from the 1840s through the late 1860s. That is not the earliest period of postal operation. Records from before the 1840s, while sparse, exist in various collections, and records from after 1870 become considerably more complete. So the missing material is concentrated in a specific middle window, not evenly distributed across all early postal history. That concentration raises the question of what was particular about the 1840s through 1860s that would make records from those specific decades more vulnerable to loss than records from earlier or later periods. The standard explanation doesn't offer a clean answer to that question. The conditions cited, poor record keeping, fire risk, limited storage, administrative transitions, were not unique to the 1840s, 1860s window. They applied in earlier decades as well. Some of them continued into the 1870s and beyond. So why does the gap concentrate so specifically in this period? The timing has a precision to it that random and general causes don't naturally produce. And that precision is one of the details that makes the first doubt difficult to set aside. Some archivists have noted these observations quietly, in finding aids, in footnotes, and in internal reports about collection completeness. These are not public accusations or dramatic claims. They are the careful, measured observations of people who work with these materials professionally and who have noticed that the pattern of what is missing does not match what the standard explanation would predict. Their observations don't reach firm conclusions. They raise questions, but the questions they raise are specific enough to be worth taking seriously. The selectivity of the losses, the clustering by document type, the survival of financial records alongside the absence of operational ones, the concentration of gaps in a specific time window, collectively suggest that the losses may not have been as random or as incidental as the standard account implies. This doesn't mean the losses were deliberate, or that anything was actively hidden. It is entirely possible that the selectivity reflects factors that are explainable, but not yet fully understood. Perhaps financial records really were treated with enough additional care to account for the imbalance. Perhaps the 1840s, 1860s concentration reflects some specific combination of conditions during that period that hasn't yet been fully identified. But those remain open possibilities, not settled answers. And what makes the pattern worth continued attention is precisely that the existing explanations don't close the question. They leave it partially open. The doubt is not about whether records are missing. They are. The doubt is about whether the explanation for their absence, random loss through a combination of general historical conditions, adequately accounts for the structured, selective, and temporally concentrated nature of what is gone. That question remains genuinely unresolved. What makes this particularly worth examining is how quietly the observation tends to be made. The researchers and archivists who notice the pattern typically do not make strong claims about it. They note the imbalance. They flag the clustering. They observe that the selectivity is difficult to explain. And then they move on, because the evidence doesn't clearly point toward a specific cause. The doubt sits in the record, documented but unresolved, noticed but not explained. And it continues to sit there, in the gap between what the standard explanation predicts and what the actual archival evidence shows. A small but persistent problem that the available answers have not yet fully addressed. To get a clearer sense of why the missing records matter so much, it helps to step back and look at what these postal systems actually were before 1870. Not in abstract terms, but in concrete ones. How large were they? How were they organized? What kind of documentation did they generate? Because the scale of the operation is directly relevant to the scale of the missing record. And when you look at the actual size and structure of these institutions, the volume of material that should have survived, but didn't, becomes a more pressing question than it might initially appear. The United States Post Office Department is a useful place to begin. It was not a new institution in the mid-1800s. It had roots going back to the colonial period, and by the time the country became an independent republic, a formal postal system was already in place. The post office was one of the first federal agencies established under the new government, and it grew steadily throughout the early decades of the 19th century. By the 1840s, it had become something considerably larger than a modest administrative body. It was, by most measures, one of the largest civilian government operations in the United States at that time. The numbers give some sense of the scale. By the mid-1840s, the post office was managing thousands of post offices spread across the country. It employed thousands of workers, postmasters, mail carriers, clerks, route agents, and inspectors. It maintained contracts with private mail carriers operating across hundreds of routes, many of them covering difficult and remote terrain. And it was handling millions of individual pieces of mail every year. These were not small, informal operations being run out of someone's front room. They were organized, funded, and administratively complex institutions operating at a national level. Similar systems existed elsewhere. In Britain, the General Post Office had been a major national institution since the 17th century. By the mid-1800s, it was managing a national network of routes, employing a large professional workforce, and operating under detailed regulatory frameworks. France had a comparable structure, as did many other European countries. These were mature bureaucracies, not identical to one another, but sharing the fundamental characteristic that they were large, organized, and administratively sophisticated. They operated under legal frameworks. They answered to governments. They processed enormous volumes of transactions every day. And this is the detail that matters. Bureaucracies generate paperwork. That is not a description, it is almost a definition. A government institution managing thousands of employees, hundreds of contracts, and millions of transactions cannot function without documentation. Every postmaster appointment involves paperwork. Every contract with a mail carrier requires a written agreement. Every route inspection produces a report. Every complaint received from a member of the public generates a log entry. Every delivery confirmation, every financial account, every staffing change, all of it requires documentation to function properly and to be auditable by central authorities. The volume of records that a system of this size would have generated is not small. It is very large. This is where the missing record problem becomes more significant, because the question is not whether records were generated. They were. The scale of the operation makes that certain. The question is where those records went. And when you look at what survives in archives today, the surviving material represents only a portion, in some cases a very small portion, of what the operational scale of the institution would lead you to expect. Some archives hold reasonably strong collections from this period. Others have almost nothing from the same decades. The variation between collections is itself part of the puzzle. At first, the variation between archives seems like it might simply reflect different levels of care taken by different institutions over the years. Some archives preserved their materials well, others didn't. That kind of institutional variation exists in many historical record collections and is not unusual by itself. But when you look more closely at which materials survive and which don't, even within the better preserved collections, the picture becomes more complicated. It is not just that some archives have less than others. It is that across archives, the same categories of records tend to be the ones that are thin or absent. That cross-institutional pattern points toward something more than simple variation in archival care. Consider what a well-functioning postal administration of the 1850s would have needed to document on a routine basis. Route contracts alone would have generated significant paperwork. The Post Office Department regularly contracted with private carriers to transport mail on specific routes. Those contracts specified routes, schedules, payment terms, and performance requirements. They were legal documents with financial implications. Renewals, amendments, and terminations all required additional documentation. A system managing hundreds of routes would have had a corresponding volume of contract documentation in active use at any given time. Where's all of that material now? Route inspection reports are another category worth considering. The postal system employed inspectors whose job was to travel routes and assess their condition, the quality of the roads, the reliability of the carriers, the state of the post offices along the way. These inspections were a regular part of how the system monitored its own performance. The reports they generated were sent up the administrative chain, reviewed by supervisors, and filed. They were working documents of the institution. They described conditions on the ground in specific places at specific times. As historical sources, they would be enormously valuable, and yet they are frequently absent from pre-1870 collections. Complaint logs are similarly elusive. Postal systems in the mid-1800s received complaints from the public about lost mail, slow delivery, unresponsive postmasters, and various other problems. These complaints were recorded. Investigations were sometimes opened. Responses were sent. All of that activity generated documentation, and documentation generated in response to a public complaint is typically the kind of record that institutions treat with some care, because it has potential legal and reputational implications. But that category of record, too, tends to be underrepresented in what survives from the pre-1870 period. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if you accept that these records were generated in large quantities, as the operational scale of the institution requires, and you also accept that they are now largely absent from the archive, then the explanation for their absence needs to account for something significant. It needs to explain how a large, organized, government-funded institution lost the majority of its operational documentation from a specific period of its history. Not all of its documentation, not randomly distributed portions of it, but specifically the operational records from a specific window of time across multiple countries and multiple administrative systems. The inconsistency between archives adds another layer of complexity. If all archives had similar gaps, the pattern would suggest a universal cause, something that affected the entire record at roughly the same time. But the gaps are not perfectly uniform. Some collections are more complete than others. Some regions have stronger records than adjacent regions. Some document types survive in one archive, but not in comparable archives nearby. This variation is itself interesting, because it suggests that the losses were not caused by a single event or a single decision applied uniformly across the whole system. There was some variation in what happened, but within that variation, the overall pattern of what tends to be missing remains recognizable. That combination, a consistent overall pattern with variation in the details, is actually harder to explain than either a perfectly uniform gap or a completely random one. A perfectly uniform gap would point toward a single coordinated cause. A completely random gap would support the standard explanation of incidental loss through varying conditions. But a pattern that is consistent in its general shape, while varying in its specific details, suggests something more complex. It suggests multiple causes operating within a general framework, or a general cause applied with variation in its implementation. Neither of those possibilities maps cleanly onto the standard explanation. The inconsistency between archives also raises a question about knowledge. The people who managed these archives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were professionals. They knew what their collections held. They knew what types of records their institutions had generated. When materials were missing, they were generally aware of it. In some cases, they noted the gaps in finding aids and catalog descriptions. But in other cases, the gap between what should be there and what is there passes without clear comment. Large categories of expected material simply don't appear in the catalog, with no explanation offered for their absence. That silence is not proof of anything specific, but it is a feature of the record that researchers occasionally find puzzling. What makes all of this particularly worth examining is the relationship between scale and expectation. A small, informal system that kept irregular records might reasonably produce an incomplete archive. Gaps would be expected, but the postal systems of the mid-1800s were not small and informal. They were large, organized, and administratively mature. They were producing documentation as a necessary function of their daily operations. The expectation for the volume of surviving material should be correspondingly high, and when the surviving material falls significantly short of what that expectation would predict, the shortfall itself becomes something that requires explanation, not just acknowledgement. Exactly when the bulk of the missing material disappeared from the record, and exactly why, remains genuinely difficult to determine. Researchers working in specific archives have sometimes been able to trace the history of particular collections well enough to identify approximate periods of loss. But a comprehensive account of when and how the pre-1870 postal record became as incomplete as it is today does not yet exist. The losses happened at different times in different places, through processes that varied in their details. What they share is the outcome, a record that is significantly thinner than the scale of the institution that generated it would lead anyone to expect. And that gap between expectation and reality remains one of the central unresolved questions in this area of historical inquiry. When researchers move past the question of how much is missing and begin looking carefully at what actually survives, something curious starts to emerge. The surviving records don't form a coherent picture. They don't connect to one another the way a complete or even a partially complete archive would. Instead, they sit in isolation, fragments that reference other documents, point toward follow-up records, and assume the existence of accompanying materials that are simply not there. The problem is not just that the archive is thin. The problem is that the archive is discontinuous, and discontinuity of that kind tells a different story than simple loss through neglect or disaster. To understand what discontinuity means in practical terms, consider how administrative records normally relate to one another. In any organized institution, documents don't exist independently. They are part of chains. An appointment record for a postmaster leads naturally to the operational records of the office he managed. A complaint received by the postal system generates an investigation file, which produces a report, which may lead to a follow-up action, which is itself documented. A contract with a mail carrier connects to route inspection reports, which connect to performance reviews, which connect to renewal or termination decisions. These chains of documentation are how bureaucracies function. One record references another. The pieces fit together because they were created as parts of an interconnected system. But this is where it becomes unclear, because in the pre-1870 postal record, the chains are broken. Researchers find the beginning of a chain, an appointment record, a regional summary, a contract, and then the next link simply isn't there. Not damaged, not illegible, just absent. A postmaster's appointment record from 1855 exists in the archive. The corresponding route log for his office, which should sit alongside it and document what his office was actually doing, is gone. The appointment tells you who was there. The route log would tell you what they did. One survives, the other doesn't. And that division between records that establish personnel or structure and records that document actual operations appears repeatedly across multiple collections. A regional report from 1863 offers another illustration of the same pattern. Such reports were summary documents, compiled by supervisory officials and sent upward through the administrative chain. They described conditions across multiple offices in a given region, noted problems, flagged complaints, and referenced ongoing investigations. They were, in a sense, maps of what the postal system was doing and where it was experiencing difficulties. And some of these reports have survived. They exist in archives. Researchers can read them. But when those reports reference follow-up documents, the investigation files, the complaint records, the correspondence generated in response to the problems they describe, those follow-up materials are frequently absent. The report survives, but the substance it pointed toward does not. That pattern is significant. It means the surviving record is not just incomplete in quantity. It is incomplete in a structurally particular way. The documents that provide context, reference, and summary sometimes remain. The documents that contain the actual operational detail, the specific actions taken, the specific communications exchanged, the specific outcomes reached, tend to be the ones that are gone. This is not what random loss looks like. Random loss takes whatever happens to be in the path of whatever destroys it. It does not consistently remove the operational layer of the record, while leaving the administrative layer partially intact. At first, it seems like this might simply be a coincidence of preservation. Certain types of documents stored in more secure locations, others stored less carefully, leading to differential survival over time. That explanation has some surface plausibility. Documents considered important might have been kept in better conditions than documents considered routine. If regional summary reports were stored in central repositories, while local operational records were kept only at the local office level, then the summary reports might have had a better chance of surviving, simply because of where they were kept. The structural difference in storage location could produce a structural difference in what survives, but the explanation becomes difficult when you examine it more closely, because the records that are missing were not all local or routine. Route inspection reports, for example, were not purely local documents. They were generated by traveling inspectors and submitted to supervisory authorities. They moved up the administrative chain. They should have ended up in central files alongside the regional summaries that reference them. If the regional summaries survived, the inspection reports that fed into them should have had a comparable chance of survival. And yet the inspection reports are frequently absent, while the summaries that reference them remain. This is where the nature of the loss becomes a genuine question. Fires, floods, and physical deterioration are the causes most commonly cited to explain missing historical records, and all of them are real. But each of these causes has a characteristic signature. Fire destroys everything in a given location. If a storage room burns, everything in that room is lost, regardless of document type, regardless of content, regardless of what the documents reference. Water damage operates similarly, affecting materials based on physical proximity to the source of moisture. Gradual deterioration from poor storage conditions also tends to be indiscriminate, degrading whatever is present in a given environment over time. None of these mechanisms naturally produces the kind of selective, structurally patterned absence that researchers observe in the pre-1870 postal record. For the pattern to emerge from physical causes alone, you would need those physical causes to have acted differently on different categories of documents, destroying the operational records while sparing the administrative summaries, removing the follow-up files while leaving the reports that reference them. That would require a very specific and consistent alignment between document type and physical storage condition, replicated across many different offices and many different institutions. It is possible in theory, but it is not the most natural outcome of random physical damage. Some historians have suggested that the pattern reflects deliberate choices made by administrators during the reform period of the early 1870s. The argument is that when postal systems were reorganized, officials reviewed existing holdings and made decisions about what to carry forward into the new system and what to discard. Under this view, the records that survived were the ones deemed administratively useful or legally necessary under the new framework. The records that disappeared were the ones considered obsolete, no longer needed for current operations, and not worth the cost of long-term storage. This is a deliberate culling, but a bureaucratic one, not secretive, just practical. That explanation has a certain plausibility. Deliberate selection during administrative transitions does happen. Organizations regularly decide what to keep and what to discard when moving from one system to another. And if administrators in the 1870s were applying a practical filter, keeping structural and financial records while discarding operational details from the previous era, that could produce something like the pattern researchers observe. Appointment records and financial summaries would be kept because they established ongoing obligations. Route logs and complaint files would be discarded because they described conditions that no longer applied. However, the timeline does not fully match this explanation in all cases. Deliberate culling during the 1870s reforms would explain gaps in records up to the point of the reform, but the discontinuities appear across a longer stretch of the pre-1870 period. not just in the years immediately before the reforms, but throughout the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. If the culling happened at a specific moment during the transition, why does the discontinuity extend so evenly across multiple decades? And why, in some cases, do the gaps appear in records from periods that would have still been operationally relevant even after the reforms? Others are not convinced by the deliberate culling argument at all. Some researchers argue that the evidence for organized, systematic disposal during the reform period is itself limited. If a deliberate culling had taken place on a significant scale, you would expect some documentation of that process, disposal orders, inventory lists marking what was removed, correspondence between officials discussing what to keep and what to discard. Some of that documentation exists, but it is not comprehensive enough to account for the full scale of what is missing. And in some cases, it is entirely absent, meaning the disappearance of the records is not accompanied by any administrative trail explaining how or why it happened. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the absence of documentation about the disposal is itself a form of gap. In a well-run bureaucracy, significant decisions about the destruction or removal of official records tend to leave traces. They are authorized by someone, implemented by someone, and noted somewhere in the institutional record. When those traces are missing alongside the records themselves, the silence becomes a feature of the pattern rather than simply a background condition. It doesn't confirm any specific explanation, but it adds to the sense that the standard account doesn't fully capture what happened. The uncertainty between these interpretations, accidental loss versus deliberate culling versus some other cause, is precisely what makes the pattern unusual. If the evidence clearly supported one explanation, researchers would accept it and move on. But the evidence doesn't clearly support one explanation over another. The physical causes don't fully account for the selectivity. The deliberate culling argument doesn't fully account for the timeline or the absence of documentation about the disposal itself. And the combination of the two doesn't resolve all of the specific discontinuities that researchers observe when they examine what survives and what connects to what. What remains is a set of broken chains. Records that begin but don't continue. Reports that reference documents that can't be found. Appointments that exist without the operational history that should accompany them. The archive from this period is not simply thin. It is structured in a way that suggests something specific was removed from it, or was never allowed to accumulate in the first place. Whether that something reflects deliberate choice, specific physical events, or a combination of factors that hasn't yet been fully identified remains an open question. The discontinuity is real. The explanation for it is not yet complete. And that gap between what is observed and what is understood continues to sit at the center of this particular historical puzzle. Around the mid-1860s, something began to shift inside several national postal systems at roughly the same time. This was not a coincidence in the narrow sense. The world was changing during this period in ways that naturally affected how governments managed communications infrastructure. Wars had reshaped political boundaries. Industrial expansion was accelerating. Telegraph networks were beginning to connect cities and regions in ways that were transforming how information moved. And postal systems, as the primary institutions responsible for long-distance communication, were caught in the middle of all these changes. The administrative pressures they faced during this period were real, significant, and well documented. But there is a detail sitting inside this period of change that doesn't fully fit the standard narrative built around it. In the United States, the end of the Civil War in 1865 brought immediate and substantial pressure on federal institutions to reorganize. The war had strained government operations across every department. The post office was no exception. Routes had been disrupted. Personnel had been displaced. The postal system serving the Confederate States had operated separately for 4 years and now had to be reintegrated. New territories in the West were opening up and demanding postal service. The institution was under pressure to expand, standardize, and modernize simultaneously. Administrative reorganization during the late 1860s was not a choice. It was a necessity. And that reorganization produced real changes in how the postal system operated and how it documented its operations. In Britain, a different but equally significant shift was underway. The post office there was preparing for a major structural expansion that would culminate in the nationalization of telegraph services in 1870. This was a large and complex undertaking that required significant administrative preparation. New organizational frameworks had to be developed. Existing systems had to be reviewed, and in some cases restructured. The institution was growing in scope and responsibility, and the internal machinery of management had to grow with it. Again, these were real changes, undertaken for real reasons, and their effects on record-keeping practices during the transition period are documented to at least some degree. Other countries were navigating similar pressures. The integration of telegraph services with postal infrastructure was a widespread challenge during this period. Managing two different communication technologies within a single institutional framework required new administrative approaches. Classification systems had to be updated. Personnel structures had to be adjusted. The documentation frameworks used to manage one type of operation didn't always transfer cleanly to the other. These transitions created genuine administrative disruption, and it is reasonable to expect that record-keeping suffered during periods of rapid institutional change. The standard explanation uses exactly this context to account for the gaps in the pre-1870 postal record. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the standard explanation, as it is usually presented, assumes a specific sequence of events. The reforms happen. The old system is reorganized. During the transition, some records are lost, discarded, or allowed to deteriorate. The result is a gap in the archive that corresponds to the period of transition and the years immediately preceding it. That sequence makes logical sense. Institutional disruption during a transition period leading to record loss during or shortly after that transition. It is a straightforward and believable chain of cause and effect. The problem is that the actual pattern of missing records doesn't always follow that sequence. Some of the most significant gaps in the pre-1870 postal record appear in material from the late 1840s and 1850s, periods that predate the major reforms by a decade or more. These were years when the postal systems in question were not in transition. They were operational, stable in relative terms, managing their existing routes, processing their existing volume of mail, and generating their standard documentation. There was no major reorganization underway that would explain why records from this period would later disappear. The reforms that came in the late 1860s and early 1870s were still years in the future, and yet the records from this earlier, more stable period are frequently absent from the archive in ways that the transition period explanation doesn't account for. That timing discrepancy is subtle. It is not the kind of thing that stands out immediately when you first encounter the missing record problem. The gaps are real, the reforms are real, and the connection between them seems natural. It takes a more careful look at archival inventories, at the dated materials that do survive, at the internal references within existing documents, to notice that the timing doesn't always line up as cleanly as the standard explanation implies. But researchers who have done that more careful work have observed the discrepancy and noted it. It is a documented feature of the problem, not a speculative inference. The significance of the timing discrepancy lies in what it rules out. If records from the early 1850s are missing, records generated during a period of normal operations, years before any major transition, then the transition cannot be the cause of their absence. Something else would have had to account for those specific losses. And once you acknowledge that some portion of the missing material predates the reforms, the clean explanatory framework of transition-era disruption begins to develop cracks. It explains part of the pattern. It doesn't explain all of it. And the part it doesn't explain is precisely the part that appears earliest in the timeline. The records from the most stable operational period, the years when the most consistent documentation should exist. One possible response to this observation is that the losses from the earlier period were caused by different factors: physical deterioration, local disasters, or poor storage conditions, while the losses from the transition period were caused by the administrative disruption. Under this view, the missing record problem has multiple causes operating at different times, and the transition-era explanation covers one segment while other explanations cover earlier segments. That is a reasonable position, and it doesn't require abandoning the standard account entirely. But it does require acknowledging that the standard account is incomplete, that it covers some of the pattern, but not all of it. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept as stated, because the standard account is often presented as a comprehensive explanation. Fire, poor record-keeping, and administrative transitions together account for the gaps. But if some of the gaps predate the conditions those causes describe, the account is not comprehensive. It is partial, and a partial explanation that is presented as complete is, in a meaningful sense, a misleading one, not necessarily intentionally, but misleading in its effect on how the problem is understood. The detail about the timing also interacts with what was discussed earlier about the selectivity of the losses. The missing material is not random. It clusters in specific document categories, operational records, delivery logs, internal correspondence, while financial and administrative summaries survive more consistently. If the losses before the reform period were caused by random physical factors, you would not expect them to show the same selectivity as losses during the transition period. Random physical causes don't sort documents by category, but if the pre-transition losses show the same categorical pattern as the transition-era losses, that suggests a consistent mechanism operating across both periods. Not two different causes producing coincidentally similar outcomes. That possibility raises questions that the standard explanation doesn't directly address. What mechanism could produce the same pattern of selective loss across two different periods, separated by a decade or more, through what are supposedly two different sets of causes? The question doesn't have an obvious answer within the standard framework, and the absence of an obvious answer is itself worth noting, not as proof of anything specific, but as a sign that the explanation may be less complete than it appears. Some researchers who have examined archival inventories from this period have noted the timing discrepancy without drawing strong conclusions from it. Their approach is careful and measured. They observe that the timeline of the losses doesn't perfectly match the timeline of the reforms. They note that this creates a gap in the explanatory account, and they acknowledge that they don't have a clear alternative explanation to offer. The discrepancy is real, but what it means is uncertain. That combination of real observation and uncertain interpretation is characteristic of how careful researchers approach this problem, and it is part of what makes the problem genuinely difficult rather than simply neglected. However, the timeline does not fully match in another respect as well. The reforms that are cited as a cause of record disposal were not instantaneous events. They unfolded over years. In the United States, postal reorganization in the post-Civil War period continued well into the 1870s. In Britain, the telegraph nationalization of 1870 was followed by years of integration work. If records were being disposed of during these reform processes, the disposal should have been spread across the reform period, not concentrated at a specific moment. But in some collections, the gaps appear to have a sharper boundary than a gradual, multi-year disposal process would naturally produce. That sharpness is another small detail that doesn't fit perfectly into the standard framework. None of this is to say that the reforms had no effect on the record. They clearly did. Administrative transitions of a scale that occurred during this period inevitably affect record-keeping. Documents are lost, discarded, or simply forgotten during periods of rapid institutional change. That is a genuine and well-supported observation. The question is not whether the reforms contributed to the gaps. They probably did. The question is whether they explained the full pattern, including the timing, the selectivity, and the geographic consistency of what is missing. And on those specific dimensions, the alignment between the explanation and the evidence is less clean than the standard account suggests. What the timing discrepancy ultimately does is shift the problem slightly. It moves it from a question of cause, what destroyed the records, to a question of sequence. When did the losses actually occur? And does that timing match the causes being offered? That is a more specific question, and it is one that the standard explanation hasn't yet fully answered. The reforms happened. The records are missing. But the gap between those two facts, the question of whether one caused the other, in what sequence, and through what mechanism, remains less settled than it might appear. And that remaining uncertainty is what keeps the timing discrepancy as an open and unresolved element of the larger puzzle. When you step back from any single archive and begin looking across multiple countries, something becomes harder to ignore. The missing 1870 postal records are not a problem confined to one nation, one institution, or one set of historical circumstances. The pattern repeats. It appears in different countries, in different languages, under different governments, and within different administrative traditions. And that repetition changes the nature of the problem in an important way. A gap in one archive is a local issue. A gap that appears consistently across many archives, in many countries, at roughly the same historical moment, is something that requires a different kind of explanation. One that accounts not just for what happened at a single place, but for why the same thing seems to have happened in so many places at once. The British case is one of the clearest examples outside the United States. The General Post Office in Britain was one of the oldest and most established postal institutions in the world by the mid-19th century. It had been operating in a recognizable form since the 17th century. By the 1850s and 1860s, it was a large and sophisticated bureaucracy managing a national network that had been significantly expanded and reformed following the introduction of the penny post in 1840. It was not a young or unstable institution. It had decades of administrative experience and a well-developed record-keeping culture. And yet British postal archives from the period before 1870 show gaps that are comparable in their general character to the gaps observed in American collections. Specific document types underrepresented, operational records harder to find in administrative summaries, certain time windows thinner than the scale of the institution would predict. France presents a similar picture. The French postal system during the Second Empire period, roughly the 1850s and 1860s, was operating under a centralized government that placed significant emphasis on administrative order and documentation. The Second Empire was not a period of institutional chaos. It was a period of active state management, infrastructure investment, and bureaucratic consolidation. Records were generated in large quantities across all government departments. And yet the postal archives from this period in France show inconsistencies that researchers have noted. Gaps in the operational record, missing categories of documentation, and an overall picture that doesn't fully reflect the administrative intensity of the period it covers. The pattern extends further. Canadian colonial postal records from the 1850s and 1860s, managed first under the province of Canada and then reorganized following Confederation in 1867, also have notable holes. Australian colonial postal records from the same era, spread across separate colonial administrations in New South Wales, Victoria, and other territories, show comparable absences. These were not federated national systems yet. They were separate colonial administrations, operating independently of one another and with limited coordination between them. And yet the gaps in their postal records follow a pattern that is recognizable when placed alongside the gaps in British, American, and French collections. This is where the cross-national dimension of the problem becomes genuinely significant. The countries involved are not just different. They are administratively, culturally, and geographically distinct. They operated under different legal frameworks. They used different languages. They had different relationships between central and local government. Their postal systems were organized on different principles and managed by different types of officials. If the missing records were caused by factors specific to one country's history, a particular disaster, a particular administrative decision, a particular institutional culture, you would not expect the same pattern to appear across all of these different contexts. And yet it does. At first, it seems like the most natural explanation for a cross-national pattern is a cross-national cause. And researchers have identified what appears to be a plausible candidate. During the 1860s and 1870s, postal reform movements spread rapidly across the developed world, influenced heavily by the success of Rowland Hill's penny post reform in Britain. Hill's model, which introduced uniform, prepaid, low-cost postage, had transformed the British postal system and demonstrated that modern postal practice could be both more efficient and more accessible than the systems it replaced. Other countries took notice. Reform movements emerged across Europe, North America, and the colonial world, all drawing on similar principles and often consulting directly with British reformers and administrators. This international reform movement created a genuine common thread connecting postal systems in different countries during the same general period. Countries that adopted reform-era principles were also, to varying degrees, reorganizing their administrative frameworks, updating their classification systems, and moving away from older operational models. If those transitions led to the disposal of records generated under the older systems, the reforms could account for a pattern of record loss that appears across multiple countries, not because any single authority directed the disposal in all of them, but because all of them were going through comparable transitions at roughly the same time. That is a reasonable theory. It is probably correct in at least some of its details. Administrative transitions during reform periods do lead to record disposal, and a globally synchronized reform movement could plausibly produce globally similar patterns of archival loss. Some researchers find this explanation largely sufficient. They argue that the cross-national consistency of the missing records reflects the cross-national consistency of the reform process, and that what looks like a mysterious pattern is actually the predictable outcome of many countries modernizing their systems simultaneously. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to accept as complete, because the reform theory accounts for the broad shape of the pattern, many countries, similar gaps, similar time period, without accounting for its specific character. The question that remains is not just why records are missing across multiple countries. The question is why the same types of records are missing across multiple countries. The operational documents, the delivery registers, the internal correspondence, the route inspection reports. These specific categories appear with disproportionate frequency in the missing material, regardless of which country's archives you are examining. The reform theory explains why there might be gaps. It doesn't clearly explain why the gaps should be so consistent in what they target. Think about what international postal reform actually involved at the administrative level. Different countries adopted reform principles at different times, through different legislative processes, managed by different officials, within different institutional structures. The specific decisions about what to keep and what to discard during each country's transition would have been made independently, by people who were not directly coordinating with their counterparts in other countries. There was no international committee deciding which document types to preserve and which to eliminate. Each country's administrators made their own choices, and yet the outcome, in terms of which categories of records survived and which did not, is similar enough across countries to constitute a recognizable pattern. That similarity in outcome, produced by supposedly independent decisions in independent administrative systems, is harder to explain than it might initially appear. If the decisions were truly independent, you would expect more variation in what survived and what was lost. Some countries might have prioritized route logs while discarding financial summaries. Others might have done the reverse. The specific choices would vary because the people making them varied. But the pattern of what survives, financial and administrative documents more often than operational ones, appears consistently enough across countries that the independence of those decisions becomes somewhat questionable. Or it suggests that there was something common about the way all of these systems were structured that led independently to the same disposal choices. However, the timeline does not fully match the reform explanation in the cross-national context either. The penny post reform in Britain was introduced in 1840. The major wave of postal reforms inspired by it in other countries occurred through the 1850s and 1860s, culminating in the formation of the Universal Postal Union in 1874. If the record losses were caused by reform-era transitions, you would expect the timing of the losses to roughly follow the timing of the reforms in each country, earlier in Britain, later in countries that adopted reform principles later. But what researchers observe is that the gaps appear in roughly the same historical window across most of the countries involved, regardless of exactly when each country's specific reform process peaked. The temporal alignment is closer than the staggered timeline of reform adoption would predict. That alignment is a subtle detail. It doesn't prove anything on its own, but it adds to the sense that the cross-national consistency of the missing records is not fully explained by the international spread of postal reform, because the timing doesn't track the reform timeline as closely as the theory would suggest. Something about the mid-19th century, the 1840s through the late 1860s, appears to be a particularly vulnerable period for postal records across many different countries, regardless of exactly where each country was in its own reform process. Some researchers have pointed to the broader context of mid-19th century governance as a possible factor. This was a period of significant institutional change across much of the developed world, not just in postal systems, but in government administration more broadly. New approaches to record management, archival practice, and documentation standards were emerging and being debated. The idea of the National Archive as a permanent institutional memory was still developing in many countries. Before that concept was firmly established, attitudes toward the long-term preservation of administrative records were more variable. Documents that didn't seem immediately useful were sometimes simply discarded, without the kind of careful appraisal that modern archival practice would require. Under this view, the cross-national pattern reflects a broadly shared cultural moment in the history of record-keeping, rather than any specific shared cause. That observation has merit, and it probably contributes something to the picture, but it shares the limitation of the other broad explanations. It accounts for general gaps without explaining specific selectivity. A broadly casual attitude toward record preservation would produce broadly random losses. It would not consistently spare financial records while eliminating operational ones. The specificity of what is missing remains the hardest part of the pattern to account for, regardless of whether the explanation is framed in terms of local disasters, administrative transitions, international reform movements, or general attitudes toward preservation. What the cross-national dimension ultimately does is raise the scale of the question. This is not a problem about one country's postal history. It is a problem about the historical record of a global communications infrastructure during a specific and important period of its development. The records that are missing would, if they existed, provide an unusually rich picture of how information, commerce, and government communication actually functioned across the mid-19th century world. Their absence leaves a gap not just in postal history, but in the broader historical understanding of that period. And the consistency of that gap across so many different archives and so many different countries remains, for now, a pattern that is clearly real and only partially explained. The missing postal records are not simply a problem for people who study postal history. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the scale of what is absent from the archive. Postal records from the mid-19th century were not narrow, specialized documents of interest only to those researching the mechanics of mail delivery. They were among the most comprehensive documentary sources available for understanding how society actually functioned during that period. They captured movement, commerce, communication, and institutional activity in ways that few other record types could match. When they are missing, the loss is felt far beyond the boundaries of any single academic discipline. To understand why postal records carry such broad historical value, it helps to think about what mail actually represented in the mid-1800s. For most people and most institutions during this period, written correspondence was the primary medium of long-distance communication. There was no telephone. There was no electronic messaging. If a family member moved to another city, correspondence by mail was how contact was maintained. If a business conducted transactions across regions, commercial correspondence traveled through the postal system. If a government official communicated with a counterpart in another district, the postal route was the channel through which that communication moved. The postal system was not one communication option among many. It was, for practical purposes, the only one available for most purposes. This means that postal records from the mid-1800s functioned as an indirect record of a vast range of human activity. Route logs documented which areas were connected to the communication network and how frequently. Delivery registers captured the volume of correspondence moving between communities. Postmaster records documented who was administering these connections in specific locations at specific times. Together, these materials provide a kind of infrastructure map of mid-19th century society, showing not just how the postal system worked, but how communities, businesses, families, and governments were connected to one another through it. When that map is incomplete, the picture of the society it served becomes correspondingly harder to reconstruct. Genealogists are among the researchers who feel this loss most directly. Tracing family movements in the mid-1800s is already a complex undertaking. Census records, land records, church registers, and immigration documents all contribute to building a picture of where families were and how they moved. But postal records add a dimension that other sources often cannot provide. They can help establish that a family was present in a specific location during a specific period, They can document correspondence connections that reveal relationships and networks. In cases where other records are ambiguous or absent, postal documentation sometimes provides the additional thread that allows a family history to be traced. When that thread is not there, the trail simply stops. Economic historians face a comparable problem from a different direction. The mid-19th century was a period of significant economic transformation in many parts of the world. Industrial production was expanding. Trade networks were growing. New financial instruments and commercial practices were developing. Understanding how these changes actually unfolded, which regions were connected to which markets, how commercial correspondence flowed, where trade activity was concentrated, requires access to records that document the infrastructure through which commerce operated. Postal route data is one of the most direct sources available for this kind of analysis. It shows which communities were commercially connected and how intensively. When those records are missing, economic historians working on mid-19th century commerce are working with an incomplete picture of the infrastructure that shaped the patterns they are trying to understand. Legal historians encounter the gap from yet another direction. The mid-1800s produced a significant volume of legal activity involving the postal system directly. Fraud cases in which the mail was used to transmit false documents or deceptive correspondence. Land disputes in which the timing of correspondence was relevant to establishing legal claims. Contract enforcement cases in which the delivery of documents through the postal system was a legally significant event. In all of these situations, postal records could serve as evidence, establishing when a document was sent, whether it was received, and what route it traveled. When those records don't exist, the evidentiary foundation for reconstructing legal history becomes thinner. Cases that might have been documented through postal records leave gaps in the legal historical record as well. But this is where it becomes unclear in a broader sense, because the pre-1870 period is not a minor or peripheral chapter in history. It is a period that covers events and processes of major significance across multiple dimensions of historical inquiry. In the United States, it encompasses the decades leading up to the Civil War, the war itself, and the beginning of Reconstruction. It covers the large-scale westward migration of the mid-century period. It includes the early stages of industrialization and the rapid development of new economic and social structures. In Britain, it covers the height of Victorian expansion and the beginning of major social reforms. In many other countries, it covers the foundational years of modern national institutions. All of these events and processes left documentary traces across many different record types. Court records, land records, census data, newspaper archives, legislative records. All of these contribute to the historical picture of the mid-19th century. But postal records would have contributed something specific and irreplaceable to that picture. The documentary evidence of how communication, movement, and connection actually functioned at the ground level of society during these transformative years. Their systematic incompleteness means that historians working on almost any aspect of this period are working without a significant category of primary source material that should, by the scale of the institution that generated it, exist in much greater quantity than it does. At first, researchers working in other fields don't always realize they are about to hit this particular wall. They are following a trail of evidence that seems to be leading somewhere productive. A genealogist tracking a family migration finds evidence that the family was in a particular region during the 1850s and turns to postal records to confirm the connection. An economic historian working on regional commerce patterns finds a reference to postal route data in a secondary source and goes to the archive to locate the primary material. A legal historian investigating a fraud case from the 1860s finds a reference to postal correspondence in court records and looks for the corresponding postal documentation. Each of them is following a reasonable research strategy. Each of them is expecting to find something. And then the trail goes cold. The document they need isn't there. Not damaged, not restricted, not held in a different location. Simply absent from the collection in which it should logically appear. At that point, each researcher receives some version of the same explanation. Records from this period were lost or were never consistently kept. And for many researchers, that explanation is accepted and the inquiry moves on, redirected toward whatever alternative sources might partially fill the gap. But for some, the explanation doesn't quite satisfy, because they can see, in the same archive, that similar records from nearby offices or nearby years did survive. The gap isn't total, it's selective, and that selectivity makes the standard explanation feel less adequate. That detail sounds minor at first, a few missing documents in one corner of a large archive. But when the same experience is replicated across multiple researchers, in multiple archives, in multiple countries, the cumulative effect becomes significant. The collective blind spot created by the systematic incompleteness of the pre-1870 postal record is not small. It is a gap in the primary source base for an entire historical period, one that affects research in genealogy, economic history, legal history, social history, and administrative history simultaneously. Each individual researcher may encounter only one piece of the gap, but the gap itself is much larger than any single encounter with it suggests. This raises questions about what historians may have concluded, or failed to conclude, because of the missing material. Historical interpretation is shaped by the sources available. When a significant category of primary source material is absent from a period, the interpretations built on the remaining sources may be subtly skewed, not through any fault of the researchers, but simply because the full evidential picture is not available to them. It is difficult to know what conclusions might look different, or what questions might have been asked differently, if the pre-1870 postal record were more complete. But the possibility that the absence has shaped historical understanding of this period in ways that are not fully visible is worth taking seriously. The frustration of researchers who hit these gaps unexpectedly is not just a matter of inconvenience. It points to something more substantive about the nature of the missing record. When a researcher finds that similar records from nearby offices or nearby years survived, the explanation that records were simply lost or never kept becomes harder to accept at face value, because the nearby survivor demonstrates that survival was possible. Records from comparable offices, comparable periods, and comparable administrative conditions did make it through. If survival was possible for those records, the question of why it wasn't possible for the missing ones becomes more pointed. The comparison doesn't provide an answer, but it makes the absence feel more specific, and therefore more in need of explanation than a general account of historical record loss would suggest. The broader implication is that the pre-1870 postal record gap is not a passive absence. It is an active constraint on historical knowledge. Every research question that would benefit from mid-19th century postal documentation is affected by it. Every interpretation of this period that relies on other sources rather than postal records is shaped, at least in part, by the fact that postal records are not available to inform or complicate it. The gap doesn't just leave questions unanswered. It prevents certain questions from being asked in the first place, because researchers know the sources to answer them don't exist. What remains is a recognition that the missing records matter in ways that extend well beyond the specific question of why postal documentation from before 1870 is so incomplete. They matter because of what they would have revealed about a critical period in the history of multiple societies. They matter because of the research questions that cannot be fully answered without them. And they matter because the explanation for their absence, however it is eventually understood, will say something about how institutional records from this period were managed, preserved, or lost. That understanding is still incomplete. The gap in the historical record is matched, in some respects, by a gap in the understanding of how and why that gap came to exist. When the standard explanation begins to feel insufficient, researchers naturally start looking for alternatives, not because they are searching for something dramatic or conspiratorial, but because the evidence they are working with doesn't fully fit the account they have been given. That is a normal part of careful historical inquiry. When the facts don't align cleanly with the explanation, you look for better explanations. And in the case of the pre-1870 postal record gap, several alternative interpretations have emerged over time, each with its own internal logic, each supported by some portion of the available evidence, and each leaving some portion of the problem still unresolved. The first and perhaps most straightforward alternative interpretation is the deliberate culling theory. This view holds that the missing records are not the product of random loss or incidental disaster. They are the product of organized decisions made by administrators during the reform period of the 1870s, decisions to deliberately destroy certain categories of records as part of a broader effort to modernize and standardize the postal system. Under this interpretation, what looks like mysterious disappearance is actually intentional disposal. The records were removed because the people managing the transition decided, for practical reasons, that they were no longer needed. This interpretation deserves to be taken seriously because deliberate record disposal during institutional transitions is not unusual. It happens in modern organizations regularly, and it happened in 19th century government administration as well. When a new classification system replaced an old one, documents generated under the old system sometimes didn't map cleanly onto the new framework. Administrators reviewing holdings during a transition might reasonably have concluded that operational records from the old system, delivery logs, route registers, inspection reports, were no longer administratively useful. They described conditions that no longer applied. They used categories that the new system had replaced. Keeping them would require storage space and management resources that could be directed elsewhere. Discarding them was a practical choice, not a secretive one. Under this view, the losses are intentional but entirely bureaucratic in character. There's no hidden motive, no sensitive information being protected, just administrators making efficient decisions about what to carry forward and what to leave behind during a period of significant organizational change. The fact that those decisions produced a large and consequential gap in the historical record is, from this perspective, an unintended consequence rather than a deliberate outcome. The administrators who made the disposal decisions were not thinking about what future historians would need. They were thinking about managing an institutional transition. But this is where the deliberate culling theory runs into difficulty. If the disposal was organized and intentional, it should have left traces. Organized disposal processes in bureaucratic institutions typically involve authorization. Someone decides what will be discarded and communicates that decision through the administrative chain. Disposal orders are issued. Inventories are taken before the disposal, noting what was present before it was removed. In some cases, formal records of the disposal itself are created, logs noting what was destroyed, when, and under whose authority. These traces are not always comprehensive, but they tend to exist in some form when deliberate disposal has taken place at scale. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because in many of the cases where pre-1870 postal records are missing, the expected administrative traces of deliberate disposal are also absent. The records are gone, and so is the documentation that organized disposal would typically generate. That double absence is harder to explain through a straightforward culling theory. Organized bureaucratic disposal leaves paperwork. Untraced disappearance does not. And what researchers find in many cases is closer to untraced disappearance than to documented disposal, which doesn't rule out the culling theory, but does complicate it. The second alternative interpretation focuses on a different aspect of how the pre-1870 postal system operated. Before the major reforms of the late 1860s and 1870s, a significant portion of postal routes in many countries were operated not directly by government employees, but by private contractors. Individuals and companies entered into contracts with the postal authority to carry mail on specific routes, under agreed terms, in exchange for payment. This was a widespread practice. It was how the postal system managed the enormous geographic scope of its operations without employing an even larger direct workforce. Private contractors were a structural feature of the system, not an exception to it. The implication of this for the record gap is significant. If private contractors were carrying the mail, they may also have been generating and holding some of the records associated with their routes. Delivery logs, route performance records, and operational documentation related to contracted routes might have been maintained by the contractors themselves rather than by the government postal authority. Under this interpretation, the records exist, or at least existed, but they never entered the public archive. They remained with private contractors. And when those contracting arrangements ended, when companies changed or dissolved, when individuals retired or died, the records they held were not transferred to any government repository. They simply disappeared into private hands and eventually ceased to exist. This theory has genuine historical support. The contracting arrangements of the mid-19th century postal system were extensive and varied. Different contracts gave different levels of responsibility to contractors, and it is entirely plausible that some operational record-keeping responsibility went with those contracts. Some researchers find this explanation quite compelling as an account of at least part of the missing record. It doesn't require any unusual decisions or any problematic motives. It simply reflects the structural reality of how the postal system operated and the predictable consequences of that structure for long-term record preservation. However, the private contractor theory doesn't explain all dimensions of the pattern. Government postal authorities did maintain their own records of contracted routes, the contracts themselves, payment records, performance evaluations, and correspondence with contractors. Some of this material survives, but the operational detail that would have been generated during the actual carrying of mail, the day-to-day documentation of what moved where, is often absent even from government holdings, not just from contractor records. And the categorical selectivity of the missing material, the consistent absence of operational records across many types of offices, not just contracted routes, suggests that the contractor explanation covers part of the gap, but not all of it. The third interpretation is the one that researchers approach most carefully, because it moves into territory where the evidence is thinnest and the implications are most significant. This view suggests that some of the missing records document activities that later administrations had reasons to prefer were not preserved. Not all postal operations in the mid-19th century were straightforward. The postal system was used for purposes beyond the simple delivery of personal and commercial correspondence. Financial arrangements of various kinds moved through the mail. Political communications between officials, between party organizations, between government figures and their allies, traveled through postal channels. And in some countries during some periods, postal systems were involved in the surveillance of correspondence, the opening, reading, and sometimes suppression of mail deemed politically sensitive. All of these activities generated records. Financial arrangements required documentation. Political correspondence left paper trails. Surveillance operations, where they occurred, produced logs of what was intercepted and what was done with it. These records would have been sensitive by their nature. Some of them might have been embarrassing to later administrations that preferred to distance themselves from earlier practices. Some might have documented irregular financial arrangements that subsequent officials would not have wanted scrutinized. Some might have recorded political activities that, with the benefit of hindsight, reflected poorly on the institutions involved. That detail sounds minor at first, the idea that some records might have been inconvenient to preserve, but until it is examined more closely, its full implication isn't visible. Because if even a portion of the missing material was removed or allowed to disappear because of what it contained, the absence is not incidental. It is directional. It points toward specific types of content, sensitive financial arrangements, political operations, surveillance activities, that someone at some point considered better left undocumented, and that directional absence is structurally different from accidental loss, even if the two are impossible to distinguish from the outside. Some believe this interpretation goes too far. Others disagree and argue that the sensitivity of some postal operations is well documented enough to make the theory plausible. The honest position is that it cannot be confirmed or refuted with the evidence currently available. And that is precisely what makes it an uncomfortable theory to sit with. The records that would either support or disprove it are the records that are absent. The absence is both the evidence for the theory and the barrier to testing it. That circularity doesn't make the theory correct, but it does make it impossible to dismiss with confidence. Each of these three interpretations, deliberate bureaucratic culling, private contractor record holding, and sensitivity-driven disappearance, has something to recommend it. None has been fully confirmed, and the careful, honest assessment held by most researchers who have worked in this area is that the actual cause of the missing records is probably not any single one of these theories. It is more likely some combination of them, operating in different proportions in different places and different time periods. Bureaucratic disposal explains some of the gap. Contractor record holding explains some of it. Physical loss through fire and deterioration explains some of it. And the possibility of sensitivity-driven disappearance may explain some portion that the other theories don't account for. But the exact combination remains genuinely unclear. That is the honest position, and it is worth stating plainly. Researchers have proposed plausible theories. They have identified factors that likely contributed to the missing record. They have noted patterns that the standard explanation doesn't fully account for. What they have not done, and cannot yet do with the available evidence, is produce a comprehensive, verified account of why the pre-1870 postal record is as incomplete as it is. The pieces of an answer exist. They have not yet been assembled into a complete picture. What that unresolved state means in practice is that the alternative interpretations remain on the table, not as confirmed explanations, but as live possibilities that the evidence doesn't rule out. Each of them implies something slightly different about what happened to the missing records and why. Each points toward a different understanding of how the pre-1870 postal system operated and how its documentation was subsequently managed. And each leaves the central question: what exactly caused this specific pattern of archival loss across so many countries, in so many document categories, during this specific historical window, still without a fully satisfying answer? After everything that has been examined, the scale of the missing material, the selectivity of the losses, the timing discrepancies, the cross-national consistency, the alternative theories, and the limitations of the standard explanation, it is worth pausing to consider where the inquiry actually stands. Not to deliver a conclusion, because the evidence doesn't support one, but to take stock honestly of what is known, what remains uncertain, and what that uncertainty means for how this particular historical problem should be understood going forward. That kind of honest accounting is sometimes more useful than a premature answer, and in this case, it is the only responsible position the evidence permits. The first thing that can be said with confidence is that the gap is real. This is not a matter of interpretation or perspective. The pre-1870 postal record gap is a documented feature of archives in multiple countries. Archivists have noted it. Researchers have encountered it repeatedly. Finding aids in collections across the United States, Britain, France, Canada, and elsewhere reflect it. In the thinness of pre-1870 holdings, in the absence of expected document categories, in the broken chains of administrative documentation that leave questions without answers. The gap is not something that requires special argument to establish. It is a straightforward observational fact about what exists and what does not exist in the archival record. The second thing that can be said is that the official explanations are not wrong in what they cover. Fire destroyed records. Poor storage conditions degraded materials over time. Administrative transitions during the reform period led to the disposal of older documents. Inconsistent early record keeping meant that some materials were never created or preserved in the first place. All of these things happened, and all of them contributed to the incomplete state of the pre-1870 postal record. The standard explanation is not fabricated. It reflects real historical processes that had real effects on the survival of documentary material from this period. But this is where it becomes unclear, because covering part of the picture is not the same as covering all of it. And the specific features of the missing record, its selectivity, its timing, its cross-national consistency, are precisely the features that the standard explanation handles least well. Random loss through fire and deterioration does not produce consistent categorical patterns. Administrative transitions in one country do not automatically produce matching gaps in archives on different continents. Poor early record keeping does not explain why financial records from the same offices and the same periods survived when operational records did not. The standard explanation accounts for the broad outline of the gap, while leaving its most specific and most puzzling characteristics unexplained. Researchers who work carefully in this area are aware of this limitation. Most of them are not claiming that the gap reflects something deliberately hidden, or that the missing records point toward any specific scandal or concealment. Those are strong claims, and the evidence does not clearly support them. But most careful researchers are also not fully satisfied with existing explanations. They hold their conclusions carefully, acknowledging what is known, noting what doesn't fit, and resisting the temptation to fill the remaining uncertainty with confident claims in either direction. That careful, measured position is the honest one, and it is the position that the evidence, taken seriously, tends to produce. What remains unresolved is not a minor detail. It is the core of the question. Why are the losses selective in the specific way they are? Why do the gaps appear in the same historical window across countries, with different administrative cultures and different institutional histories? Why does the timing of the losses not always align with the timing of the reforms that are supposed to explain them? Why is the documentation of the disposal itself sometimes absent alongside the records that were supposedly disposed of? These questions have been raised. They have not been answered. And the gap between the questions and the available answers is where the genuine uncertainty lives. That uncertainty is not comfortable to sit with. There is a natural human preference for resolved questions and complete explanations. When something is missing from the historical record, the instinct is to find out why and to arrive at a satisfying account. But the pre-1870 postal record gap resists that resolution. The evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously. The alternative theories each explain part of the pattern without explaining all of it. And the combination of factors that probably accounts for the full picture has not yet been identified with enough precision to constitute a settled answer. The uncertainty is not a failure of inquiry. It is where the inquiry currently stands. There is, however, a reason to think that the picture may become clearer over time. Digital cataloging projects have been transforming archival research in recent decades, and their potential relevance to this specific problem is significant. Archives that were previously accessible only to researchers who could physically visit them are now being digitized and made available online. Materials that were cataloged decades ago under older classification systems are being recatalogued with greater precision and detail. In some cases, digitization projects have uncovered materials that were present in collections but effectively invisible, misfiled, uncatalogued, or stored in ways that made them inaccessible to earlier researchers. Some of those discoveries have already changed the picture in small but meaningful ways. Materials that were believed to be lost have occasionally surfaced during digitization efforts, found in collections where they were not expected, identified through keyword searches that manual research methods could not have performed, or recognized as postal records after years of being miscategorized under different headings. Each such discovery is a reminder that the boundary between lost and undiscovered is not always a fixed one. Some of what appears to be absent from the record may simply be present in a location where no one has yet looked carefully enough. At first, this possibility seems like a straightforward reason for optimism. If digitization can uncover previously unknown materials, perhaps the gaps in the pre-1870 postal record will narrow as more collections are processed. Perhaps materials that appear to be lost will turn out to be misfiled in adjacent collections, waiting to be identified. Perhaps the picture that emerges from ongoing cataloging work will be significantly more complete than the picture available today. That is a genuine possibility, and it is one that researchers working in this area take seriously as a reason to continue looking rather than to accept the current state of the archive as final. But the optimism has limits. Not everything that appears to be missing is simply undiscovered. Some of what is absent from the pre-1870 postal record was almost certainly destroyed through fire, physical deterioration, or deliberate disposal, and no amount of cataloging effort will recover it. The materials that burned in the Chicago fire of 1871 are gone. The documents that deteriorated in poorly maintained storage rooms over the course of a century or more are gone. The records that were deliberately discarded during administrative transitions, if that is what happened, are gone. Digitization can find what still exists but has not yet been cataloged. It cannot recreate what no longer exists in any form. This means that even in the most optimistic scenario, even if ongoing archival work uncovers significant new material, the gaps in the pre-1870 postal record are unlikely to close entirely. Some portion of what is missing will remain missing. The question is what proportion of the gap represents undiscovered survival versus genuine permanent loss. And that question cannot be answered until the cataloging work has progressed further than it has today. For now, the boundary between the two categories remains uncertain. That uncertainty compounds the larger uncertainty about why the gaps exist in the first place. If future discoveries clarify the nature and extent of the missing material, they may also shed light on the causes of its absence. Finding significant quantities of pre Pre-1870 postal records in unexpected locations would suggest that the material was misfiled or relocated rather than destroyed, which would point toward different causes than if exhaustive cataloging continues to confirm that the records are simply not there. The outcome of ongoing archival work will eventually contribute to the explanation, even if that contribution takes years or decades to materialize. Chapter KO Kaunenu Crow 10-minute Kalia. 9:36 a.m. The pre-1870 postal record gap does not end with a clean summary. It ends with more questions than answers, and that in itself is part of what makes it worth continuing to examine, because historical problems that resist clean resolution are often the ones that reveal something important, not just about the specific topic under investigation, but about how records are created, managed, and lost across time. The postal record gap is one of those problems. It has layers, and each layer that gets examined reveals another layer beneath it that hasn't yet been fully explored. One of the dimensions that deserves more attention than it typically receives is the question of who had access to these records while they still existed, before they disappeared from the archive, whether through destruction, disposal, or some other process. The records were present somewhere. Someone managed them. Someone had physical custody of them. And in some cases, the question of who held custody of specific records during the period between their creation and their eventual absence from the archive is itself an interesting and underexplored area of inquiry. Custody matters because it determines who had the ability to preserve, transfer, or remove records. Understanding the chain of custody, where the records were held, by whom, and under what institutional arrangements, could shed light on how and why the losses occurred. The custody question is complicated by the decentralized nature of the pre-1870 postal system. Records were not held in one place. They were distributed across thousands of local post offices, regional supervisory offices, and central administrative bodies. Each of these locations held different types of records. Each had different levels of institutional stability and different standards of care for the materials in their possession. A post office in a major city, housed in a permanent building with professional staff, was in a very different position from a post office in a small frontier town, operated by a part-time postmaster out of a general store. The conditions for record survival varied enormously across this distributed network. But this is where it becomes unclear, because if the conditions for survival varied so enormously, you would expect the pattern of loss to reflect that variation. Urban offices, with stable infrastructure, should have produced better preserved records than rural offices, with minimal resources. The losses should cluster at the margins of the system, the smaller, less well-resourced offices, rather than appearing with similar frequency across offices of different sizes and capacities. And yet, the categorical pattern of what is missing, the consistent absence of operational records alongside the relative survival of financial ones, appears across offices of different types. That consistency across varying conditions is one of the features of the pattern that straightforward explanations don't cleanly account for. There is also the question of what happened during the transfer of records from local offices to central repositories. At various points during the 19th century, efforts were made to centralize postal documentation, to bring local records into regional or national archives, where they could be better managed and more easily accessed. These transfer processes were themselves opportunities for loss. Documents could be damaged during physical transport. Items could be misfiled or miscategorized during the transfer process, and decisions about what to transfer and what to leave behind could have been made, formally or informally, by the officials responsible for managing the transfer. If certain categories of records were systematically left out of transfer processes, either by policy or by practical judgment, they would have been left in local custody, where their long-term survival would have been much more precarious. Some researchers have looked at the records of transfer processes themselves, the inventories taken before transfers, the receipts issued for materials received, the correspondence between local and central officials about what was being moved, and found that these records, too, are sometimes incomplete. The transfer documentation is thin in ways that make it difficult to reconstruct exactly what moved from where to where and when. That thinness in the documentation of the transfer process is another layer of the problem, a secondary gap, sitting alongside the primary gap in the operational records themselves. At first, The idea that transfer records would also be incomplete seems like it might simply reflect the general conditions of 19th century record management. Everything from this period is somewhat incomplete. That is part of the context. But when transfer documentation is absent specifically for the periods and categories where the primary records are also missing, the coincidence becomes harder to dismiss as simply general incompleteness. The absence of transfer records for the same materials that are absent from the archive creates a situation where the path from creation to disappearance cannot be reconstructed even in outline. And that inability to reconstruct the path is itself a feature of the problem that deserves attention. The international dimension of the problem also has aspects that haven't been fully explored. The Universal Postal Union, established in 1874, created a new framework for international postal cooperation that connected the postal systems of member countries in ways they had not previously been connected. The formation of the UPU involved significant exchange of information between national postal authorities about practices, standards, route structures, and operational methods. It also involved, in some cases, the sharing or comparison of records, whether those exchanges had any relationship to the pattern of missing pre-1870 records, whether materials were transferred between national systems, or whether the process of preparing for UPU membership affected how individual countries managed their existing holdings, is a question that has not been extensively investigated. That detail sounds minor at first. An international postal organization formed in 1874 seems like a late development relative to the gaps that appear in records from the 1840s and 1850s. But the preparation for international standardization began before the formal establishment of the UPU. Countries were reviewing their systems, comparing their practices with those of other nations, and in some cases reorganizing their administrative frameworks in anticipation of the new international structure. If that preparatory process affected how pre-existing records were managed, what was reviewed, what was considered worth preserving, what was seen as an embarrassing reminder of older and less standardized practices, it could be a factor in the pattern of losses that hasn't yet been adequately considered. Some believe the international dimension is the key to understanding why the pattern is so consistent across countries. Others disagree and argue that the similarities between national archives reflect parallel but independent processes rather than any connected cause. The evidence doesn't clearly resolve that disagreement. What it does suggest is that the international context of postal development during this period, the exchange of ideas, the spread of reform models, the growing coordination between national systems, is relevant to understanding the record gap in ways that purely national-level explanations don't fully capture. There is one more dimension worth considering, and it concerns the researchers themselves, the people who have worked with these records over the decades and who have formed the professional understanding of what is and isn't present in the archive. The understanding of the pre-1870 postal record gap has developed gradually through the accumulated work of many individual researchers working in different archives on different questions. No single study has comprehensively mapped the gap across all relevant archives. No systematic comparative project has examined the pattern of losses across multiple countries with the level of detail that the problem probably deserves. The picture that exists is built from many partial investigations, each of which has illuminated one corner of the problem without capturing the whole. That means the current understanding of the gap may itself be incomplete in ways that aren't fully visible. Individual researchers working in one archive may not be aware of parallel observations made by researchers working in other archives. Patterns that are visible only when multiple collections are compared may not have been noticed because the comparison hasn't been systematically made. The understanding of the problem is, in a sense, subject to the same kind of fragmentation that characterizes the records themselves, dispersed, incomplete, and not yet assembled into a fully coherent picture.